Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the second edition of How She Does It. Today, I'm joined by the magnificent, truly magnificent Dr. Philippa Tumubweinee, who is the head of the School of Architecture and basically, what is geomatics? I'm going to get into this, but building science and geomatics, which is very interesting to me because I have no clue what that is. Philippa is an immensely impressive individual who's the head of the school and is going to tell us all about how she got to where she is right now, and also a little bit about the implication of we're in the middle of this lockdown, living in our houses all day, every day in the built environment. And obviously it's impacting on a number of us in different ways, but I think it's become so much more relevant to our lives than we even realized before. So without further ado, I'm going to start the chat. Hello.
Hi, how are you? I'm good.
Good. Thank you. We were just saying that here we are in our homes. And we're quite fortunate to have homes with multiple rooms and things like that. But how the built environment has suddenly become everything in our lives.
It has. Well, good morning. Thank you firstly for inviting me to this platform. It's truly a privilege. Thank you very much for that. And you are right. It's architecture and the built environment has suddenly become very topical. And that's mainly because we're in it. It's our constant companion all day, every day, all the time. So it has become quite topical. And for me, I think there's lots of interesting avenues that are starting to open up in this conversation. But it's an interesting phenomenon, interesting change.
Indeed. I mean, I'm finding it somewhat oppressive sometimes. Going, oh my gosh, trying to recreate new vistas for myself, new little settings as I do these interviews, going, look, there's a whole new world out there, a whole new perspective. But Philippa, I'd like to perhaps take everyone back to your beginning. Did you always know that you were going to be an architect? And perhaps, did you have a calling as a young girl? I mean, firstly, let's talk a bit about your childhood. I think that's quite significant. You're one of a twin?
I'm a twin. So my
I mean, that is a powerful force of nature.
There is. So I'm one of two, and I was born on the 22nd of March, 1979. So I'm 41, turned 41 this year. And 5 a.m. in the morning on the 22nd of March, we were born. My mother said this was the most uncomplicated, fuss-free entry into the world. Literally within an hour, the two of us were born. It was done and dusted. That was it. I'm the youngest of six, and I was born in the capital city of Uganda, Kampala. And from there, because I was born in the middle of a war, actually, my parents then moved to a small town out of a city shortly after we were born in the southwest of Uganda called Kabale. Now, Kabale is famous for two things. I'll tell you what the two. So one is its proximity to where the mountain gorillas are. That's it. It's close to where the mountain gorillas are. And it's also famous for the people that come from there, which are who are called Bachiga. I'm one of those people. And in Uganda, we're generally known as being quite candid and unfiltered and quite brash. And my father says this is because Bachiga have never had any form of governance. It was a series of small settlements. There were never chiefs, never any kings. So we don't do governance very well. And I think this kind of filtered through into my personality growing up. To my mother's
Well, that is interesting. I mean, in terms of actually probably your approach to management. So we'll get onto that later.
Well, so that's kind of where I come from. But I think growing up, when you asked, did you always know what you were going to do? On the one hand, I would say no, but there's a yes in there as well. So growing up, what a lot of things happened. I had a very interesting family setup and still do, family dynamic. I've got polar opposite parents, like a very strict authoritarian mother and a very explore the world father, which was a bit of a contradiction growing up. You get a bit confused as a child. But the one incident when I was in school, and this is going to tie directly into why I'm doing what I do today, or how I do what I am doing today. I was about 16 and something happened. I was in boarding school, which is a very strict environment. Those days, there was very little rights for anyone who was not eligible to vote. Something happened and I organized the arts class and we staged a little mini, I think of it as civil disobedience. The school saw it as a rebellion. And but it was very significant for me because we managed to, in a very autocratic environment, clearly state what we thought was an infringement of our rights. And we managed to, as a class, actually submit ourselves for consequences, for punishment. We were suspended for a while. We had to do an external and internal suspension. But we did this together. We went through it together. We bore the consequences together. We overcame those consequences together and became very good friends after that. And for me, that incident for me highlighted a very important thing, which was working collectively. You see, when a group of people rally around something or an interest that benefits everybody, they become a collective and they become exceptionally powerful. Let's fast forward into how I got into architecture. For me, architecture, firstly, for me, it's a religion. It's a way of being, it's a cult. I cannot see myself as anything else but an architect. It's quite sad, actually, but there we have it.
Everyone needs something to believe in, Philippa.
I beg your pardon?
I said everyone needs something to believe in. It may as well be architecture.
It may as well be. And it's a really good
thing. Who your gods are.
Absolutely. Well, the gods change, luckily. In the religion of architecture, there is no one god. There's several and they can change and you can drop them and you can pick others up. Phenomenal. It's a really egalitarian religion. But architecture is one of those disciplines that allows for collective action. So you don't design or build a house or a building or an environment on your own. You do it collectively with different people who do different things, who think differently, who understand things differently. And that for me has been quite phenomenal in terms of where I have gotten. And I apply that in every aspect of my life. It's about a collective. In terms of what I do today, which is run the School of Architecture, Planning and Geomatics, I'll get back to what you were asking about. I do this as a collective because in the world, the problem with the world today is we are told you as an individual must rise. You must go above everybody. You've got to shine. You have to stand up. I think there's an alternative to that. See, within a collective, if we're in a collective and you succeed, your success becomes mine. If you fail, I provide the support for you to be able to overcome that failure. So the power of that collective, I think, is incredibly strong. And going through what we're going now, I think it's starting to become highlighted. We can no longer sit in our insular bubble and exist. We have to collectively do something. We're in this.
It's quite powerful. I'd like to know what the precise nature of the revolution was in the art class. What were they doing to you?
Well, it was, at that time, I felt very strongly about this, I'll have to say. So it was a very strict boarding school. And when you got to a certain level, which was as a more senior student, we were allowed to, once a month, go home for the weekend. Very important if you're spending 3 months in boarding school. And the art teacher decided to have our sculpture exam on the Saturday morning. On the weekend, we were supposed to go home. I took great offense to that.
Sure.
And very great offense. And we decided as a collective, if we all don't pitch for the exam, there can be no exam.
So, okay, I see your point. You were speaking of your relationship with your mother. I mean, it seems that she had quite a strong impact on your thinking during this period.
Yes, yes. So my mother and I have it's an interesting relationship, but I think it's a very strong relationship. We're completely different. We think very differently. She's relatively quiet and unassuming, but she's an incredibly strong personality. And I think I picked that up from her. So you can imagine as a daughter, when your mother has a strong personality and you're emulating that strong personality, you tend to clash quite a bit. So I think I learned how to deal with that with conflict because of my mother and I. We're completely different. We're both strong in our own right. And that allowed for me to be able to start navigating conflict. But I think also more importantly, she's been a rock. She grew up in a different time, in a different era. The opportunities for women then were different. The possibilities for women then were different. But even then, she always pushed me to move beyond where I was. She would always say, this is what my life is and has become, and this is what I do, but it should not limit what you can do. I mean, to this day, she's constantly pushing those boundaries. And I think that speaks to a lot of women in general. We have these strong women. I mean, being a woman in the 200 years ago must have been horrific. I mean, we talk about lockdown now, but if you think about it, I think we spoke about this. 200 years ago, women were in permanent lockdown.
Permanent, the woman's room. You were never allowed out.
You were not allowed out.
To be completely covered, which seems to be the case with some of our sisters these days anyway.
Yeah, yeah.
But you know what I'm really interested in is, let's talk a bit about your academic and you know, your career. You've kind of chosen a career which is not, there's some very remarkable statistics about women in architecture, and moreover, Black women in architecture. Please, let's talk a bit about this career choice and how you found that experience of being a Black woman in this field, which is you're a very small minority.
Yes. We are a small minority. I think growing. I mean, one can't ignore the fact that there's more and more women in architecture. But I think if you speak to any woman in architecture, the first thing they will tell you is, first, I am an architect. I also happen to be a woman and of color. So first, I will declare I am an architect. I also happen to be a woman and of color. Now that brings in a whole new dynamic and set of complexities. But how I got into this field is also negotiations that I had with my parents. I always wanted to go either into the arts proper or into teaching. And my mother said, absolutely not. In this family, we are professionals. You will become a doctor. And my father said, well, let's find something professional that is creative. And it was architecture. And it was the best decision that I think I allowed my parents to make for me. And how you go through it, I was at Wits for 3 years. I moved to University of Pretoria to do my postgrad. I then started practicing and teaching at University of Johannesburg. So I'm a Joburg girl. Most of my adult life was spent in Joburg. And, I miss Joburg. Hello, Mzansi. And through that, you start to find yourself. But I think what is important, or how I got to where I am now, was the last 4 years pre-2018 that I spent in Bloemfontein. Do you know where Bloemfontein is?
Yeah, I mean, that is a very interesting...
Yeah. So at least you know where Bloemfontein is.
Hanson, okay.
The rector at that time. So Professor Hanson was the rector at that time. He's quite a phenomenal man, and I'm really privileged that I can refer to him as someone who has influenced my life. I ended up in Bloemfontein, and what's significant about my time in Bloemfontein isn't Bloemfontein itself per se. In Bloemfontein, I made two, in the context of me, radical decisions. I started and finished a PhD, and I gave up practice. So those are two key decisions that I think have led me to where I am now. By finishing the PhD, I managed to get the qualification to do the job that I do now, but also by giving up practice, I could actually attempt this job. I could never have done this job if I was still partially practicing, partially teaching. So those two decisions radically changed what happened from 2012 up until now. And I think for me, that's what's important about living in Bloemfontein. So if someone was to say, how did you get to where you are now precisely, specifically this moment in time, I would say those two decisions changed the course of my life. I could still be practicing, and as I said, for me, architecture is a religion. So the fact that I'm not practicing means I have lost my religion. I'm a-religious at the moment.
So you're teaching young acolytes about the religion. There is a role.
Yes.
And
Absolutely.
I'm very interested to talk a bit about what your PhD really entailed, because it's about the nature of the space in which people learn. That is a very interesting question. What does that entail?
So I find my PhD terribly interesting, but some people don't. So the whole premise of my PhD was to say, within higher education, particularly higher education policy and the frameworks that govern how higher education works, a lot of things are discussed. Political influences, economic influences, social influences. The one thing that is glaringly lacking is the space in which this agenda is carried out. So if you would like to have a policy, so for example, if I was staying with you in your house and you had a policy that said, we will be polite to each other and we will be good to each other, but we don't talk about where that happens, which is the space, the dining room, the bedroom, the bathroom, then actually it becomes very difficult to enact those policies. And for me, I found this very odd, that within policy and frameworks that govern an entire sector, no one is talking about the spaces in which these things happen. So you talk about a social agenda, but do your spaces at your institutions allow for social interaction? Some of them don't.
Well, I mean, it's interesting, but universities, you have this idea of universities as they have these like very
Yes.
old school, very formal buildings that speak of, I don't know, European history generally. They all look a bit like that. And then you have these quite often like attached, these quite modern buildings that like speak of something else. It's a very interesting space actually. And I suppose it's a very interesting space to work in because it kind of reflects, I mean, especially at UCT, well, throughout the country, there've been, gosh, I mean, you guys have had to deal with like each year there's something new that's happening in the educational space. And a lot of it is about stuff that is in the built environment, whether that is the statue of Cecil John Rhodes or, I mean, it's a fascinating question.
Yes. Look, for me, exploring that, because when I talk about space per se, I move beyond just material. It's also the intangible thing. It's the connections that we have. That for me is where the nuance is. So the building, the statue, those we attach meaning to based on a style, based on representation, based on an era. There's a meaning that has been attached to that. The slightly more nuanced, which is kind of where my PhD tried to focus, the more nuanced complexities of, let's call it immaterial space, not Cartesian space, the immaterial space of interaction, the immaterial space of experience, the immaterial space that actually makes or forms who we are. It's embedded within us. And I think during this lockdown, it has become even more significant. So if all you have is your four walls, if you're lucky to have four walls, then suddenly you start to engage with the immateriality of that quite seriously. So, do we go to coffee shops because we like what it looks like and what it represents? Or do we go for something else? Is it a ritual? Is it a culture? And now
And
that we don't have those
Daphne,
things,
don't forget that. We go there for our fix.
yes, we go there for our fix. But I mean, beyond the fix, why do you pick one coffee shop over another? And sometimes it's not even a convenient one that you pick. There's something within that ritual that makes us who we are. And over time, various theorists and philosophers have spoken about this intangible thing, this ritual, this way that we inhabit ourselves and our lives. And this happens in space. For me, that is important and that is key. And that's what I try to explore in the PhD. Because the buildings are one thing, and yes, you are right. There is meaning attached to those buildings. They represent something. For some people, it's oppressive, and for some people, it is not. And you have to acknowledge that that is real, even though it's a reality. But beyond that, what becomes even more powerful, there's just that feeling. It's that feeling that you get that you don't know what it is. That is the immaterial space. That is the space that is lived. That is the space that behind various important theorists, claim to be social. That is the social space. That is what makes us, and we make it. And for me, that is key. It's that social space of interaction that becomes interesting. Yeah.
So you're in the process of forming young minds.
Yes. Yes, I am.
What is it that what kind of architects, planners, and geomatics practitioners, is that the right thing?
Yes, that is right. Yeah.
um, do you envision? What would you like to see? And certainly, what does being an African architect, somebody at the heart of the African school of, I mean, there are not that many schools of architecture in Africa. So you're really forming an entire continent's worth of young minds. Tell us.
Well, I hope so. But just to go back to geomatics, geomatics actually is a very fancy word for land survey. So it's
Okay,
about collecting.
okay, okay. Thank you. I get it.
It's a really fancy word
Oh,
for land
wow,
survey because it does a lot more now. It's about information systems and how do you collate that information and data. So I don't really teach across the three divisions of the school. I'm an architect, so I teach within architecture. I teach first years, and I teach first years building technology and construction whilst wearing high heels, I might add. That spurs all the stereotypes out. But I think with my students, particularly in the first year, and I love to teach first year. I'm a first year lecturer first, and then I'm a head of school second. For me, being at a university, whether it's an architectural class or a sociology class, is about how do you allow for someone to become curious? You see, curiosity is an interesting thing. If you can't spike curiosity, you can't spike interest, you can't spike thinking, you can't spike innovation, you can't spike anything else. You've got to spark some level of curiosity. Someone's got to leave your class and go, I don't agree with Philippa. I think she's talking a lot of, but I'm curious as to why she would say that. For me, curiosity is everything. You have to be curious. As architects, it's even more important. Be curious about why does a kitchen counter stand at 900? And why is a door 2.1 meters? Don't just accept it. Be curious about it. Could it be 2.4? What happens if it's 1.6? What happens if there is no door and we have to go in through the window? Because that's where change starts to happen. That's where thinking starts to happen. I'm 41. My time is past. It's over and done. But the students in my class, and this is where I always pontificate about architecture. I have in my class the people who are going to determine your environment in the future. They are going to literally build it. That's quite a significant thing. And if they can't think beyond now and they just take whatever I give them wholesale, we have a bit of a problem. A little bit of a problem. We're not going to be able to move beyond. And I think let's take what's happening now with this lockdown. If my students can't innovatively think beyond the conditions we're in now, how do you deal with technology, public health, social interactions, people living? They can't think innovatively about things like that. Things don't look too bright in the future. So I think for me, when I'm in a class, the idea is to try and spark not only interest, but curiosity, because that curiosity is what is going to allow for them to move beyond me, what I think, what I know. And when it does happen, I mean, I'll give you an example. Last year, I had an exhibition with my first years. I've never had an exhibition before. And for me, the phenomenal thing, it was completely harrowing. I was wrecked by the end of the year. I didn't know what was happening. They didn't know what was happening. We didn't know why it was happening or where. It was terrible. After a semester of all of us not knowing what was happening, I was wrecked. I was completely wrecked. But what I learned out of that is this is a series, this was a group of young people who came together, again, the idea of collective, and did the most phenomenal thing. When that exhibition went up, and it only went up the day before, so you can imagine for 3 months, I didn't know what was happening. Neither did they. And when it went up, it was sublime because they moved beyond what I thought they should be doing, and they created their own brief, their own curriculum, their own way of learning. For me, that is, I can't teach the class anything beyond that. I cannot absolutely teach them anything beyond that. And I think that is what I try to bring when I'm in a class. I'm not sure how that always translates, but that's kind of how I try to do it in a nutshell.
I'm going to ask you one last question from my side, and then I'm going to turn to the questions on the chat, because there are a lot of questions, and which is great. Keep them coming, guys. But if you could tell yourself, your younger self, one thing, what would it be?
I think I would tell my younger self to not be too hard on myself, not take myself too seriously. Just relax, let go. Don't be so anxious. Don't be so nervous. Because as you get older, I'm sure you would know this, you start to realize actually that angst is unnecessary. It's not constructive. It's not useful. Sometimes things play out the way that they're supposed to be, and actually, most of us are quite enough within ourselves. We don't need to be like someone else. We don't need to do like somebody else. We don't need to look like somebody else. We're quite enough in ourselves. And if we stand in that power of ourselves, we can be something. So I'll tell my younger self, relax, don't be too hard on yourself. Like, don't take yourself too seriously. Just relax a little bit. Yeah.
That is fantastic. Oh my goodness, I think I've just done this yet again to myself, which is switch off the questions.
Okay.
Wait, so if I can just, here it is, here are the questions again, guys. Okay, Titsetso, who is a student, says, I'm a student still, but I have started an initiative on building sisterhood in the specific field for female students in Gauteng. Did female students during your time have some sort of bond? Because I've picked up that many sort of do their own thing and do not really bother about the next person. So how did you deal with it whilst you were studying? She hopes that makes sense. It makes plenty of sense.
It does make plenty of sense. So it's important to create networks, and I try to tell my students this, and particularly to say, so the relationship you create now at Oxley School are the relationships that are going to carry you through when you start a practice, when you start to create joint venture partnerships. It is important that you form them. So if other people aren't that interested, don't give up. Keep trying. And broaden it out, not just within your class, broaden it out to the rest of the environment. Get some boys as part of that sisterhood. They also contribute some things. I had a lot of boys in my sisterhood. In fact, I think I was the only girl in the sisterhood. But Um, but I can confidently say that a lot of times that I have been nominated to do something, that I have been awarded something, that I have been given some kind of accolade. This has been based on relationships that I created while I was at school, at university. And these are really critical. So I'm not sure how you go about creating a sisterhood. And sisterhoods don't have to be formalized things. They can be informal. It's a group of people that you see often enough and interact often enough with over time.
Yeah.
But I would say don't limit it just to architecture. Broaden that out a little bit. Get some doctors in there. That's who's going to be your client in future. Get some fashion designers in there. They're going to make your clothes. Get some more people in that. But it's about those relationships. So yes, I think it is important, and you're right. A lot of people tend to be insular, but you've got to keep trying, because for you that's going to be your power.
Huh. Khadi says, as a woman in leadership, have you ever encountered a situation where you were expected directly or indirectly to act in a certain way because you're a woman? For example, more tolerance for male behavior, especially in enforcing discipline, or expecting performance, or striving for excellence?
Yes, absolutely. The things she mentions are quite serious things, but I'll give a very simple example. So once I was in a meeting, I was running the meeting. It was my project. I was the head of the project. And we sat down, and there was a coffee station. And I said, well, would anybody like some coffee? You can help yourself. And because it was all men at the table, everyone looked at me quite expectantly because
We're now going to serve them as well.
well, as the woman, you must also serve the coffee. And so there's two ways you can react in this situation. I chose to serve the coffee. I think when, as a woman in leadership, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about women in leadership, to do not lose who you are because of what you do. I can make coffee. I make a really good cup of coffee. For me to make coffee for a couple of guys is not bigger than the issue that we have to discuss at that time. You have to weigh up where the fight is going to be. While we sit around the table, there's key and critical things that I would like to fight for. Making you coffee is not one of them. So it's about weighing up where you are going to put your energy, particularly if an environment that is male dominated. Sometimes I don't sweat what I call the small stuff, but if it's an issue that I think is critical and is going to advance women or people of color or my students, then that I will not back down from. I will not be a quiet, acquiescent woman. I will not be polite. I will not step back. I will be loud, wild, and fierce, because that I will fight for. But if you want me to make you a coffee, I will gladly make you one, because that's a small thing. So I don't know if that's kind of a useful answer.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, Titsetso wants to know, what are your thoughts on online learning regarding architecture? I see there are a whole lot of universities now. I think all the California universities have said the fall semester is going to be online.
Yes. In North America, I think the decision has been to take all the rest of this year online. So online learning in regards to architecture, I mean, 5 months ago, if you had said I could teach architecture online, I would have called you a blasphemous infidel for uttering such a word. It would have been sacrilege. But overnight, we have had to change our practice and the way that we teach, because we don't have a choice. Is it going to work? Unfortunately, I don't know. Is it going to have the same effect like you have in a studio? That's a very intimate, dynamic relationship within a studio, particularly for the performing and creative arts. You engage with your students one-on-one. You discuss, you exchange ideas, you stretch the student, they stretch you. That form of interaction is very dynamic and very powerful. How I'm going to be able to do that on Zoom, I really don't know. Or MS Teams or Skype. And it's a big it's a big problem. We are trying to find ways around it. And the only way I think that we're going to get it right is to just keep trying. Going to have to keep trying until we find something that can allow for that level of intimacy and dynamic teaching to come through. Hopefully, God willing, we will be able to go into studio. But even if we do go back to studio, that's going to have to change. I can't have 100 students anymore in studio anymore. For health reasons, that can't work. So even that's going to change. So we're not even going to go back to what we had before. Whatever, we have to look forward. So it's going to be through Zoom. It's going to be through some kind of abstracted studio space. There's going to be a different way that we do this. So I think, I don't know if that kind of answers the question, but it's,
I think that's very interesting, and it leads me to, I know I said I'd ask my questions, but forgive me guys on the live chat. But do you think that this experience will change the way that we build social space or engage in social space?
Absolutely, absolutely, going forward. I mean, public health, technology, architecture, space, and place, that's topical right. How are we going to design spaces that allow for safety in terms of public health, that incorporate technology to reinforce the standards of public health, but maintain the social interactions that we have, which are key for all of us? The worst thing about lockdown is I can't see my friends. I can't see my family. We need those social interactions. We are social beings. And what comes to mind, there was this story about a restaurant in Amsterdam that created this little glass, small greenhouses, cubicles, where they had their patrons sitting in there. So you and your friends on a little cubicle. So you're away from the next table. And that limits your social interaction, but at least you can see the other people, but at least you can be outside. I mean, for me, it was an interesting example. We're going to have to rethink the spaces in which people interact. We're going to have to rethink our home, for that matter. I'm sitting in my home, and I'm inviting a whole lot of people in. I don't know who they are. I would never have done that.
No, I know.
Yeah.
But here we are.
Here we are.
It's really interesting. Very, very interesting. Denise Musoke says, good morning. What was the toughest thing you faced during your studies, and how did you overcome it?
I think the toughest thing I faced during Archie school was being able to consistently, reiteratively work around the same idea. One, hoping that the idea was a good one, and B, hoping that the process that I was going through would lead me to somewhere. And sometimes it didn't. And the toughest thing was having to go back to that same idea and try another process, and go back to the same idea and try another process. That can be very frustrating. That for me was incredibly frustrating and very difficult to overcome.
Let me see. Kirsty McFarlane says, good morning. Have you ever had a sponsor or a mentor who helped you in your journey? And what was the key insight that you gained from this, if you did?
Well, the short answer is yes, 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 yes. I've had lots of mentors. I've been very fortunate that I've had people have opened themselves, their minds, their expertise, and sometimes even their homes to mentor me to where I am today. And I go back to the collective. Everything I am today and what I do today, I could not and I still cannot do without a whole host of people. Yeah. And I mean, if I start mentioning them now, I'm scared I'm going to miss the one. But I mean, when I was growing up, in my Archie school, when I started to teach, when I started to practice, when I was at university, whilst doing a PhD, I've had a whole host of mentors, and some of them very, very different. And I've been very fortunate that some of them are still active in my life. But the key insights that I've gotten from mentors, I think that's something I could speak to, has always been to believe in yourself, which sounds a little bit superficial and general, but I'll try and explain this a little bit more. Ultimately, within each and every one of us, there is something unique that we can contribute. Now, you might not end up being Steve Jobs or Einstein, or I don't, they're the anomaly. But all of us have got something that we can contribute. Now, the problem is we've been told it's got to be big and grandiose and it must go viral. Today, it must go viral. No, I believe that it's got to be something that you can do that is small, that causes some kind of change, incremental change. My slogan is small wins, incremental changes. It's little things, really little things. And that actually is what causes the hurricane or the tornado. Little butterfly wings over time build up and become incredible change. And all of my mentors have all emphasized that to me. Start with something that you can do. Do it well. Keep doing it well. It will start to grow and develop. That's probably the biggest insight I've gotten from my mentors.
Fantastically useful, that thought, especially now when one feels so constrained by circumstances. You can only really do small things that hopefully will make big changes. Jean Kalibala says she can only imagine that you have so many competing demands. How do you manage to balance all of them? Balance. I think she's asking the balance question.
The balance question. Routine. I have a relatively regimented routine, but also it's about, so I have routine and that's for my career. But I also understand that I am not my career. There's so much more that makes up Philippa that is not my career. And sometimes I'm not always good with having the perfect balance between career, friends and family interests. Sometimes the one tends to dominate and the others recede and the other ones dominate. And you've got to allow that to happen. It's quite fluid. But it's about routine. But I think beyond that, also understanding that you are not what you are. What you are is a part of who you are. So it's about knowing that this is just a part of who you are. But you're right. Sometimes it gets a little bit much. Yeah.
So routine is the secret. Helga is asking some very interesting questions, which are really, she says, as a master's graduate and new design lecturer, what are the key aspects you would advise for teaching design, cultivating studio culture in the time when students are very dependent on Google solutions? I think she's talking about how do you cultivate really interesting creativity, essentially, whilst in, making sure that the architectural fundamentals are in place. That first year course that you're teaching. I find that students are not spending as much time, she says, in the process of design using tools like building models and drawing, and instead they're snapping to generic platforms like Pinterest. She finds this frustrating.
I too find it frustrating, mainly because I don't even understand the generic platforms on which they are. It's quite scary. So we kind of tend to talk over each other. But I think talking studio culture, the one way you introduce studio culture is, as a lecturer, you also have to come to the party. So if they're on Pinterest, I'm not saying get onto Pinterest, but you also have to engage the platforms on which they are. I'm not always very good with that, but I work with a lot of people who are. And because if you show interest in what they're doing, just maybe they might be a little bit curious as to why you do things the way that you do. And studio culture is also around getting people to start having fun in studio, to allow for that curiosity to develop. So I would never shoot down what a student does. I would engage with it, even when I think it's absolutely dreadful. Engage with it and try and tease out what is interesting about that student. Because most lecturers tend to go, this is how we do it and this is why. But you've got to come to the party a little bit. Why is it that your class is on Pinterest? You might be surprised what you find there. I've been surprised as to what I find there and to things that I've seen. and then use that as a way in which you insert what you want to teach. Find something there that you can then insert. They are basic fundamentals. We can't get away from bricks, concrete, mortar, steel. That I do not make a compromise on. But also just to tell Helga, even though you think your students aren't paying attention now, actually they are. They're just not paying attention to you now. Later, they will remember. I'm fortunate in my studio, I was teaching with 2 ex-students of mine. It's quite strange when your first year now becomes your colleague. And it's incredible the things they remember that I said. Then they could have been less interested, but now they remember it. So it's frustrating now, but they're actually listening. They're taking it in. It's not important for them at the moment. It will be. And then they'll start to think about what you said.
And finally, let me ask the two questions. One, which I think we touched on, which was Daniel Su, XU.
Su.
I'm tempted to say Daniel. He wants to know, how has your experience changed from teaching in the Free State versus teaching in Cape Town?
That's a naughty question, Daniel. It's a very naughty question. The difference between teaching in the Free State and Cape Town is context. The Free State has a very particular context. So the Free State is flat. Flat, you can see for miles ahead. So in that context, it's flat that affects how you think, why you think the way that you do. Whereas Cape Town is more dense, and you've got the sea and the mountains. So the context has definitely changed how I teach. The numbers and the density or the collective within Cape Town in the arts or the performing and creative arts is different to Bloemfontein. So I'm a lot more experimental here than I was in Bloemfontein. Now, that could be a failing on my part. One should be experimental all the time. But there's a lot more opportunity to be experimental within Cape Town, I find, than I was in Bloemfontein. So the context has shifted how I teach and what I teach, to answer that question.
I mean, just as there's one last question from Denise, but I just want to ask it, and then I think we have to wrap it up. But I want to say, I mean, you talk about the creative space that you're in as the city informs and the context informs. What are some of the artists and design practitioners, let me put it that way, that you're enjoying right now, maybe that we can look at?
Well, I think firstly, I must say what I'm enjoying right now in Cape Town is the fact that a lot of the non-profit organizations are run by women, and these women are doing some phenomenal things. So there was an artist at Dice Mocha recently called Otto Bang. She's also an architect who is an art practitioner. She makes the most incredibly tapestries around mysticism and legends and beliefs, and she's phenomenal. I think she's a phenomenal artist. Another artist who I think is doing quite well, Blessing Gobeni. I think he's definitely taking his art practice somewhere else. I mean, there's so many. Where do I start? Where do I end? There's William Kentridge, who I think is probably one of the most, if not the most prolific artists to come out of this country, I dare say, even in the world. I mean, he just had 2 big exhibitions on the drawings at Zeiss and the sculptures at Norval. That's phenomenal. That body of work and his practice and his belief in his practice is completely out of this world. I'm not sure where I go, my personal favorites, my non-personal favorites. You have people like Willem Boshoff, you have Diane Victor, you have Sembile, you have, she's more performance. It's a hub. There's a lot coming out of South Africa, or Africa for that matter. I usually feel like a child in a candy store.
I see your palpable excitement.
Exciting, yeah.
And then I'm going to close off with Denise's question, because I think it's quite a practical question. She says, what is something you did that helped you get through architecture school, something that made it easier for you? and maybe through life, if I can extend your question, Denise.
Yeah. Through Archie school is, firstly, I was not a very good student, so maybe I'm not the one who should be answering this question. But through Archie school, again, it's routine. Most Archie school students leave it until the last minute and then have sleepless nights for four nights before the hand in. What you want to do is bite at that thing little by little every day. Same time, every day, 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, work on your project. Consistently, always, regularly work on it. And that also works in my life, and it still works in my life today. Regularly, every day, there are certain things that I do and will do consistently. So I don't try and take on everything. I go every day for 3 hours, I will attack email. And that's what I do consistently. For an hour, I will look at reading, and that's what I do consistently. Little bits by a little bit, and before you know it, it's a month later, and you've racked up 15 hours of reading. That's kind of what I would say.
So consistent practice. I'm going to take Virginia F's question, and then I will wrap it up. Just because I think it's quite a useful. She's a second-year student, and she's struggling because she's in a creative rut. She dips in and out of creative ruts. How do you get back to creativity? I think this is a very useful question for all of us. And also belief in your own idea is what she's talking about.
Yeah. So creative ruts happen. One, remember, you have not lost the creativity. It's just not apparent at this stage. Just always remember that. You still have the creativity. You just can't access it at this stage. Again, this is boring, and I've said this over and over again, and I need to stop saying it. Little by little. Get up, 15 minutes. Even if you are looking at that blank piece of paper and you cannot bring yourself to draw anything, look at it for 15 minutes and do it again, and do it again, and do it again, and do it again. Professor Hanson, who was my rector for a while, told me one thing when I asked him, how do you write so prolifically? And he said, Philippa, it's really simple. Bum on seat. How do you recover your creativity? Bum on seat. You sit there, and if nothing happens, that's okay. And eventually something will happen. But you've got to be sitting, present, engaging that blank piece of paper, which is terrifying. I always make squiggles on the side because there's nothing more terrifying than a blank piece of paper. And you will get there. You just have to keep trying over and over and over and over again. Someone famous, I can't remember, who said, what makes things extraordinary is not extraordinary. It's ordinary things done extraordinarily well. Ordinary things done well. That's extraordinary. That's creativity.
Fantastic. I think that's a wonderful place to end the conversation. Thank you so very much for taking the time and for bringing your beautiful energy to my Zoom and to the fantastic questions that we received from the wonderful audience, so engaged. And I hope to see you soon in the real world.
I also hope so. And I want to say again, thank you so much for inviting me. I want to say thank you very much to whoever has signed on and linked in. And maybe this is the real world. Maybe we'll see each other again here or somewhere else. And yeah, it's been absolutely exciting and interesting. And it's great to be able to share in a non-formal platform what I do or how I do what I do. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Have a good one. Bye.